grateful that you were able to join me today. Let's simply begin by adjusting our postures, taking in a few deep breaths. Just slowing things down. Because there's no doubt that many of us have had very busy mornings, busy weeks ahead. And this is just an opportunity to press the pause button, to no longer be distracted by all of the work, the internet browsing, the stories, the movies, the podcasts, the books. All of those, if as wonderful as they are, they tend to, they're almost always laced with likes and dislikes. When we read the internet, there are things we agree with, there are things that we strongly disagree with. That stimulates new thoughts. When we are in conversation with pretty much anyone, it's almost certain that their opinions are not always going to correspond to ours. And so there will be things that we agree with again, things we disagree with, certain things they say or do that we like, certain things that we dislike. Again, that stimulates the mind. This practice, and you've noticed most of us, we've already we already have our eyes closed, just so that we reduce the stimulation to the mind. And the mind is a funny thing, because if your eyes were open and you were to look at a decoration in your room that's not quite in the right place, that would stimulate mind. That would stimulate the mind. If a pop-up appeared on your computer, that could stimulate your mind. And so a large amount of stimulation enters into our experience through our eyes. And that is the reason why usually you see people closing their eyes during a practice such as this. But it's not essential. You don't have to close your eyes. But it can be helpful just to reduce the stimulation. And as you very gradually, you can call this a little lab, an experiment. And like the scientist, when conducting an experiment, they realize that the more things that there are in the experiment that can interfere with the experiment, the less accurate the results will be. And that's why our phones have been silenced. We're no longer browsing the net. For some of us, our eyes are closed. The body has stopped moving to a large extent, just so that we can create that kind of a lab. What is it that we're examining? What is it that we're examining? Can you notice that even with the eyes shut, with the body moving a lot less, with the phones silenced, the mind still continues to move. Sometimes it may be in response to a sound around you that you cannot control. Maybe the ticking of a loud clock that you hadn't noticed before, or a dog barking, or a car alarm going off outside in the street. Now, these are things that you really have very little control over. But these become indicators as to how easily the mind gets agitated, stimulated. Some of these things are outside of us, around us. The dog barking, mobile phone going off, loud traffic. And then some of these may have to do with the sensations that you're experiencing within your body. If you're a person who's very used to moving around and suddenly you find yourself being still like this, at least physically, you may discover new sensations arising within your body that again stimulate the mind. Now I'll ring the bell so that the experiment can begin, where we can simply watch the mind. Remember, this is about watching the mind. It's not about wrestling with the mind. It's not about forcing it to go still or forcing it to go quiet. It's just observing it. And by observing it, I simply mean noticing some of its qualities. One of the qualities is the way in which it moves almost constantly. But where does it move? Can you notice how, when it moves, it either moves into the past or into the future? Because the fact, our reality, our perceived reality at least, is that we are sitting here, breathing. Eyes may or may not be closed. You may have adopted a particular posture, some of us sitting down, some of us lying down. Our ability to command this privacy. We've asked others to give us space, to give us this privacy. And so, if you're thinking about a conversation, that's what you're doing. You're thinking about it. You're not having the conversation right now. Your mind has jumped back into the past and is repeating that conversation, or it's imagining a conversation in the future with someone. But the bell is also here to bring us back into this space, into this room, onto this chair, onto this cushion. And one thing you will notice is that the mind, it creates time, it exists within that concept called time. Notice the different faces, the different places that the mind wanders to, how they change. And then there may be some of us here in this room who actually believe that we're being completely present, we are completely aligned into the present moment. And then there is a further test that you can apply as to how present you are. And that is, am I complaining about anything? Am I complaining about anything at all? Whether it's finances, whether it's my body shape, whether it's a particular sound around me or a sensation within my body. Is there anything resembling a complaint that I can see within my mind? Because if there is a complaint, you congratulate yourself simply because you're beginning to realize that the mind isn't as aligned into the present moment as we once believed it to be. Because the mind is comparing this present moment or circumstances or stories against some standard that has been created. And these standards, they may have been created by our parents, by our communities, by our religious belief systems, and they may have to do with how much money or wealth you should have at this stage in your life, how many academic or qualifications or awards you should have accumulated, how much fame, how many followers you should have on Facebook or YouTube or whatever social media platform it is that you use. Shoulds and should nots, standards that can only exist within the mind. This next bell is so that we can release all of those standards. And how do you release these standards? How do you release the past? How do you release the future? Remember, we began this practice pretending to be scientists, observing an experiment. Now, when you watched your mind, did you notice how much it moves? How the thoughts change? How it may shift from one geographical location to the next, almost faster than the speed of light? How can you notice change? What's the prerequisite in order to experience movement or change? There must be something that is not changing. It's a little bit like just sitting on a field and watching a train move across the field on some rail tracks. How do you know the train is moving? You know the train is moving because you are not moving with the train. And many of us, we've been in those railway stations where both trains were moving at the same time and you didn't know you were moving until you looked out the other window and you saw the train station not moving, stationary. And so, in order to notice change, in order to notice movement, there must be a part of you that is not changing, that is unmoving, that is constant. And that is the part that we are tapping into in this practice. Another bell, so that you may climb outside of the mind. and into this present moment. Because this present moment is that unchanging moment. Always the present moment. Whatever your earliest memories were, as a child, you experienced a present moment. As a teenager, as a young adult, wherever it is you are right now, every moment, whether 5 hours ago or 50 years ago, was experienced only as a present moment. With the ringing of this bell, see if you can separate yourself from the story, from time, from the mind, and anchor yourself, ground yourself into the present moment. And in order to arrive into the present moment, we simply remind ourselves that we have 5 doorways into the present moment, our 5 senses. We return back to the body, where you may wriggle your toes, you may wriggle your fingers, you may remind yourself that you are here in this space, on these cushions, on these chairs, this unchanging present moment. I don't mean the things around you being constant. The things around you will almost certainly change. And I can hear that because I can hear different children playing in the playground next to my home because it's their lunch break. The sound goes up and then it goes down, and then there's a laugh, and then there are footsteps. So that's constantly changing, but the present moment isn't changing. And that is the part that we are tapping into. And even though we have these 5 senses with which to tap into the present moment, we will just begin by focusing on one, our breath. And so let this bell, with the ringing of this bell, release all of the other senses and begin focusing on just your sense of touch. But the sense of touch around the nostrils, within the nose, the nasal passage, those surfaces around the upper lip, those spaces upon which you can experience the interaction between air and skin. Just focusing on one breath. And that breath is either the breath that is flowing in or out of your body at this moment. Notice how every breath can only unfold in the present moment. You can't breathe for later on, and you can't breathe for the past. You can only breathe in the present moment. And if you did forget about the last breath, Or rather, if you were unaware of the last breath or the last 10 breaths or the last 100 breaths, with the ringing of this bell, they disappear into the past. They belong in the past. And therefore, you do not need to be hard on yourself. You do not need to scold yourself for not being present enough, because in an instant you return back into the present moment, and the breath that is either flowing in or out becomes the only breath. It becomes the first breath in or the first breath out. And the breath is a funny thing, because even with whether your eyes were open or closed, there's nothing to see. There's absolutely nothing to see unless you were standing nose to nose and close to a mirror or a pane of glass. There's nothing to see. The breath is here to be experienced. And so experience your breath. And even in the experience, you do not have to overcomplicate it. Just the temperature of the breath, the humidity levels from breath to breath. What can you experience? How is this? How are you making sense of these sensations? It's quite obvious when you breathe in, the air feels cooler, a little bit drier, a little bit crisp as it brushes against the rims, as it brushes and moves through the nasal passage. And as you breathe out, humidity, warmth, maybe this time experiencing it or even down your upper lip. In order to make sense of these sensations, you will soon discover that you need the mind. That mind which exists within time. That mind which is an accumulation of vast amounts of information, helping us to decipher and translate these very simple sensations of warmth, humidity. Have you noticed that you can only experience or understand warmth, feel warmth, if you know what coolness or crispness was? And so the mind, it retains its memory of what the in-breath was like, the temperature, and as you breathe out, as you experience the air interacting with the cells within your nasal passage, the cells, they experience a sensation, they feed it back towards the brain, but before it reaches the brain, or maybe even after it reaches the brain, it moves through the mind, and the mind labels it. This is warmth. This is what warmth feels like. This is what humidity feels like, because I have the ability, the mind is saying that I have the ability to compare the present moment against the past or the future. And in this process, have you noticed you're beginning to experience a little bit of peace, quiet, stillness? You're beginning to experience the present moment simply because the mind is aligning itself into the present moment. And it leaves its stories behind, its shoulds, its should nots, how many awards we should have accumulated, how much we should have in the bank, that conversation, what the doctors said, all a part of the story which we release as we breathe in even more deeply. And so now your mind is beginning to more actively participate in your breathing process as it regulates the way in which you breathe, the rhythm of your breathing process, as it guides you towards what a deep breath should feel like, should be like. You breathe in and deeper and deeper. And then you pause, feeling how full the lungs and the stomach are. And then you breathe out as slowly and as gently as you possibly can, experiencing, magnifying every sensation that moves through your experience. Breathing in deeply, perhaps even reaching the capacity of your lungs, and then pausing, and then taking in a little bit more air before releasing it as slowly, as gradually, as gently, highlighting the warmth, the humidity, making its way down the nasal passage, brushing against the upper lip, brushing through those tiny hairs that filter the dust within the nostril. Then you can be even more sensitive to your breath and its sensations, discovering which nasal passage it is that you are breathing through at this moment. Are you breathing through the right or the left? Because as you continue with this practice, you'll notice how your breathing switches from one passage to the next. Sometimes every 30 minutes, every 45 minutes. I guess it differs for each and every one of us, but and you're right, the mind, it might ask questions such as why this is really boring. This is so boring. And when the mind finds something boring, you begin to recognize how much we have already been stimulating it. How much how we have become servants to the mind, giving in to its every request, usually to do with more and more stimulation in the form of movies, which aren't bad. But have you noticed how movies keep getting more and more violent sometimes, just so that they can stimulate the mind a little bit more? This is a practice where we simply get to know the mind. And if we find ourselves getting bored with the breath, we also begin to recognize that we have started thinking about the breath. And nobody really wants a PhD about the breath. No, it's okay. Not so interesting to read. Not like those conversations, those stories, those books, our hobbies, our passions. But this is our experiment. And so we release the need to think about the breath and begin once again, almost as though you were starting with the first breath, experiencing the breath, the first breath, the only breath. And one further reason we are giving so much attention to our breath is precisely because it's not very interesting. Because we're here to slow our thought process down. And as we focus on our breath, we no longer stimulate or bring about new thoughts. And in the awareness of the mind, in the awareness, in the witnessing of this thought process, we have stepped outside of the mind, no longer forming new thoughts. And if you can imagine, we can use a metaphor here. One of those moments when you had a big bucket filled with water, and then initially you stirred it, you took a big spoon or a scoop and you churned the water so that it would be all wavy and choppy and ripples would appear. So that's the equivalent to stimulating the mind, bringing in something outside of it to stimulate it. Watching the news, having an interesting or distressing conversation, liking, putting yourself in a place where you either like or dislike something quite strongly. That's like really stirring the water around and round. And now, with the ringing of this bell, imagine lifting the scoop, lifting the spoon. And so the water, it continues to move. But because there's nothing there to churn it, there's nothing there to stir it, it begins slowing down. And that sums up this practice. We're at that stage right now. We're just watching the mind. Some of us, our minds might be a little bit more choppy than others. But that's okay because the mind is constantly changing. Different things stimulate different minds. But just watch, just observe. And fast forward a few minutes, the water becomes calm. It becomes still. It no longer moves. And then you might be able to see whatever and everything that lies underneath the surface. There may be shiny, magnificent stones lying at the base of the bucket, which you may have missed earlier because of all the turbulence. Perhaps they are the pearls of wisdom that have always been there, but have simply been clouded by the ripples and the waves and the movement. Watch your mind. And like the bucket, there's not a lot you can do to stop the choppiness and the waves. The more you try to do, the more you try to contain it, the more ripples appear. We simply step back, we simply observe, we simply witness, we simply allow. The key word being allow. And so give your permission, your mind permission to move in whatever direction it chooses to. Because it no longer matters how fast the mind moves, where it moves, because your identification has shifted. You have shifted your identification from the mind that is constantly moving to this witness, this observer, this awareness, this consciousness, this stillness, this present moment. Every time you find yourself being taken away by the mind, let that be the cue, the reminder, the bell ringing to return back to the breath. No longer needing to fight against thoughts or the mind, no longer needing to build dams to stop the flow of the thought stream, but simply rising above the stream, onto the banks of the stream, where you find yourself seated or lying down in the position that you find yourself in now, observing the flow, even smiling, a knowing smile, They call it a knowing smile, a smile of in awareness that we no longer need to be carried by the currents of the stream. And it is the breath, it is the sensation, or rather the sensations that surround every breath, that will help lift us up onto the banks of the stream. Now, letting your breath become a bridge between two worlds. The world outside of us, the world around us, which is subject to change, which is subject to constant change, where even within our bodies, new cells appear, old cells die off. This world around us where new sounds arise, old sounds disappear. A constantly changing landscape of sounds, some loud, some soft, almost always with gaps in between them, gaps of silence, gaps of stillness. Sounds that are only audible because of the silence behind them that allows them to be heard. This world around us, where financial stories change, financial markets change, our own bank balances change, our relationships change, our bodies change, constant change. Change that we will, for just a brief moment, give permission and allow. We don't have to do this beyond the end of this practice, but just for this moment. All of those people who have passed through our lives, we give permission to those who have just appeared. And we give permission to those who no longer appear in physical form or in physical proximity to us. We give permission. And then we bring our attention to the breath once again, so that the breath may trance the present moment into the eternal now, the unchanging now. And now take a deep breath in once again. This time, following your breath up the nasal passage, down the windpipe, through the regions of your chest, where you can experience the lungs pushing against the rib cage pushing against the chest wall. Exhaling, experiencing the warmth, the humidity. And then breathing in yet again the first breath, the only breath, all the way down into the stomach walls rising, the insides stretching. And then breathing out, experiencing the warmth, the humidity, the direction of the air flowing through the nostrils onto the upper lip. And now diving back into the stillness as you breathe in. The breath moving through the surfaces underneath you, almost as though the breath creates roots that root you, that anchor you deep into the stillness and silence of this present moment that lies underneath us, that connects us to this planet, this vast, incredible, living, breathing planet, this body of awareness that has sustained our bodies for this long, that has sustained many generations within our family, our ancestors. It knows, it is. Each breath anchoring you deeper and deeper and deeper into the only moment that can ever exist, this present moment. And we feel our connection to this planet, how its minerals nourish plant life, allow water to exist in the form it exists, nourishing every living thing on this planet, from human beings to animals to insects to the fish to the birds. And we offer our thanks and our gratefulness for every breath that we take in, every breath that we release. And as we tap into this practice, which has a very deep connection to the practices, the ancient practices of shamanic tribes and aboriginal communities that have existed from the beginning of time as we know it. Let us also suspend our disbelief. Let us suspend our disbelief that we are all connected. that we are all a part of a single family. And let us embrace the possibility that this whole world outside of us and around us, every relationship, every home, every car, every toy, every wall, every street, every leaf, every flower, every ocean, every sky, every star is but a reflection of this stillness, this kindness, this awareness that gives meaning to it all. And let us bring into our minds, or rather our hearts, all that is happening within that geographical location called the Ukraine. And release how helpless we sometimes feel as we read the newspapers, as we speak to loved ones who live in that region. And breathe in deeply, releasing an intention that begins within our own bodies, within our own experiences. That there be peace within every cell in my body. Let there be peace, let there be harmony. Because if the world outside of me, if this world around me is but a reflection, according to the shamans, if it is but a reflection of this world inside of me, let me first find harmony within my own body. And with the ringing of this bell, release that intention that the cells within the body, they begin to fall into place, into an equilibrium, where cells are no longer competing against others, where they enter into a space of harmony, stillness, peace, kindness. I'm going to ring the bell now, so just for different regions, different parts of the body. And all you need to do is just visualize the sound waves from this bell moving through that particular region, loosening and relaxing and all tightness and disharmony. The scalp, the crown, all the cells within the skull, the brain, the neurons, the cells that make up the eyes, the cells that make up the ears, the facial muscles, the breathing processes, the neck, the shoulder, the chest, the digestive system within the stomach, pelvic regions, legs, knees, calves, feet, toes. The whole body, all of its cells, finding ease and harmony amongst each other, balancing themselves, which is another way of simply referring to the immune system rising and surfacing and enveloping this whole form. And now a bell for that other part, the mind, that there be peace within the mind. This mind that translates the world around us. Now releasing this mind that is the very reason we are here. Every movement, every thing we eat, every place we go, all beginning with an intention. And so we consciously release an intention that this peace that we are tapping into, that we have had glimpses into, be experienced in that geographical region called the Ukraine, by the leadership, the Russian leadership, by all those around the world who are supporting and assisting refugees and and in the movement of people affected, that they experience the kindness, the timelessness beyond that space where patience is required. That the stillness and the peace that we have had glimpses into is shared with every being all around this planet, is shared with every form of life, from the smallest to the largest, is shared with every form of plant life, again from the smallest to the largest. And that this practice, this awareness, this intention, it continues beyond the ringing of this final bell. Recognizing that no journey ever ends, for at the end of every journey is a new beginning. And this bell to symbolize that new beginning, where we will soon step outside of this little lab that we created, where we will experience the next moment as the present moment, and the next breath as the only breath. From breath to breath and moment to moment, we begin our practice. Please feel free
Thank
to
you, Nicole.
unmute yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really appreciate all of you joining.